Great.
Yeah. We're gonna, I'll start very vaguely. We're going to follow a slightly different format this evening from the other two lectures that we did, which were more like lectures or you know, one person speaking for a time and then some Q&A afterwards. But we felt that this evening might be better if it was a bit more interactive, really. And I'm gonna have some images which I could show at any point if we felt it was appropriate. But I think it will stay in this sort of format for now, so we can see each other. And you know, if anybody who's not got their camera turned on wants to, that would be nice, just so that we can have a little bit of social contact and eye contact or whatever. I think it will work better that way, probably, but you'll see as we go along. And it's nice to see a few more people joining. So it's just as we let them come in, and then we can make a proper start. Jackie. Great. Okay, well, I think we'll start now. Very warm welcome to everyone. This is our third Holy Ground lecture or talk. And as I was just saying, it's going to follow a slightly different format from previous talks, in that we'll be in a more of a sort of discussion mode than lecture mode, as it were. But I'm really delighted that Isik and Ava, can you give us a wave, are both here. The artist duo known as Fourthland, who have been working with us and with the church members of St Andrew's in Leytonstone, and with the members of the Hindu temple that's also in Leytonstone and is literally, what would you say, Tara, about 500 meters away from the church. So very, very close proximity, the two buildings. We began this project really in April, though some of the engagement didn't really start till May for obvious reasons. We were given some Arts Council funding in March, and rather than just send it back and say, no, it's not possible, we thought, well, let's try it. Let's see what we can do using social media platforms like this. And obviously, there was a huge unknown at that point when we kicked off the project, but we felt it was worth giving it a go. So Fourthland have been brilliant. They've done whatever they could to make contact with the church members and with the temple members. And as you'll hear this evening, I think they've really gained the trust through their generosity, their time, their friendship, in some remarkable ways. I also want to introduce Chris Thornhill, who's just, well, on my screen, he's just to my right. There's Chris. Chris has very kindly offered to, well, I invited Chris to introduce this evening and also to chair our discussions for us. Chris is a lecturer at the University of Nottingham in theology, and he has a particular interest in religious practices and in artistic practices and how they sort of overlap with each other. And Chris has also known Fourthland's work in its previous incarnations, as it were, and has had conversations with them before, so has developed some ideas with them alongside their own thinking. I will just mention very briefly that it's rather sad actually today that less than 24 hours ago we decided we would have to postpone the exhibition part of the project, which we had hoped would open in January. Again, for obvious reasons, the church and the temple are both in tier 3, and there's no sign of that becoming any, that's coming out of that tier, I don't think, in January. So we're looking forward now to probably a late April, early May opening for the exhibition. But obviously we'll stay in touch with you about the project and look forward to welcoming you when we can to see the work. So for now, I'll hand over to Chris, if I may. That's and if you would like to, just unmute yourself or use the chat function. If you have any questions during what's going on this evening, just please pitch in. Don't feel you have to wait till the end to ask a question. Chris and I will keep an eye on the chat function on people's questions, and yeah, let's see what happens. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I haven't really got a proper sort of introduction planned. I could tell you a little bit more about myself in that Laura's right. I'm interested in the resonances and similarities between modes of creative practice and religious practice. And I'm particularly interested where those kind of converge over the questions of relationships to place and relationships to nature, or to kind of non-human lands and space. And the arts are so interesting at the moment because we see so many artists, Fourthland included. When I first became acquainted with Fourthland, I saw this. I saw a kind of turn to religious sources and religious modes of praxis to address contemporary questions and contemporary issues around nature and human relationships between ourselves and our connectedness with sort of place and land, and the ways in which we imagine and conceive those relationships. And what inspired me about Fourthland's work when I first became acquainted with them, it's about a year ago, wasn't it, that we first were kind of thrown together in a situation a bit like this, but in person, where we were sort of talking and sharing ideas, was I really appreciated the way in which their work kind of used symbol and myth and story and song in ways which wasn't explicitly religious, but it showed the convergence of what art and religion can do, which is to kind of create an imaginal space. And when I say imagination, I've got a very high view of the imagination. I don't mean sort of like something made up, a fantasy, and I mean like a real imaginational space where mediations and interactions can happen between people, communities of people, and people in the non-human neighbors that they live and dwell with. So I feel that you're very, very lucky to have Fourthland to come and work with you, and having spoken to Isik and Ava over the months, it sounds like you've the participants of this project have contributed a great deal and are kind of invested themselves and are co-creating this work in a really kind of authentic way, creating this mediational, imaginal space. It's not something that's been sort of dropped on them, it's sort of like an unwelcome commission or something like that. And over the last few months, we've had a few conversations with ourselves, just sort of talking a little bit about practices and history of ideas, particularly my knowledge is more of the kind of Christian Western traditions. So talking about ideas of the ways in which historically Christians in their liturgy and in their calendar incorporated all kinds of ritual and mythical practices that kind of bridged or included the locality and the place and the non-human within their sort of rhythms of their religious life. So it's a bit of a sort of consultancy role I was doing there, and I was learning via them the interesting things that was being communicated to them from the Hindu temple community as well, which I was not familiar with, which is interesting. I'm also really interested in the power of story to do that work of mediating and of creating that sort of shared imaginal space, which is why I was very inspired by this idea of creating this story, which this co-created story, I should say, in which the two groups, if you were, the two sort of like parties from the temple and the church had kind of contributed resonant images and ideas and fragments, and kind of brought them together to make something whole, you know, create this sort of unity of vision of a new myth, a new shared story, and a new kind of shared lexicon or language of symbols that was sort of brought in resonances with each of their lived traditions, but maybe created a kind of bridge in a new way. And actually, I thought a good way to kind of get us going, and I spoke to Eva and Isik about this, would be for you to hear a bit of that story. Normally when we do a kind of talk like this, we'd be in a gallery or in an exhibition space, and you'd be quite acquainted with the work already. So we thought it'd be a good idea if you could hear a bit of this story. Maybe Eva and Isik could tell us a little bit about the context in which you will be able to sort of like experience this, and then maybe some of the words and images which they give us may give us a bit of a sort of some strings in the maze in which to sort of eke out and find out what's going on with this new artwork. So I'll hand it over to them.
Thank you, Chris. Before we begin, I just wanted to honour all the beings who've joined, who've actually been part of this project over the last 9 months. So that's Chris and Nicole that I can see, Tara, Manju, and I think Pramila might also be here. So when we are talking about the project, I just wanted to share that those beings are also with us today and have very much been part of forming the ideas of the work and the story that Chris has just talked about. Oh, there is also Pramila as well.
So the way we were thinking to begin this was actually to simply ask you to listen, and you can choose how you would like to do this. If you feel like you may want to turn off your camera and sit somewhere comfortably, if you're not already, and just close your eyes and listen, you're very welcome to do so. You're also welcome to stay with your camera on and eyes open, whatever feels right for you, but just as a way of sort of coming in a little bit to the essence of the work. And as Chris said, as we can't be in the same room with the people and the work that is evolving, the story will be a way of inviting you all into that space.
And I have a little bell sound that when the story is finished, I will make this sound. And those of you who have chosen to turn your cameras off, that will be an invitation to join us back on the screen. So this is a story to call to holy ground. Thank you for arriving here, to a special place that exists in the arc of your memory, a place that has no name, a time before time, a place that is as unique as a seed. A place that forms a vast landscape that surrounds you every day.
Every day in this unique landscape, you make a journey using your feet and your senses as guides. Every day is made up of many journeys of the feet and the senses, part of a wider set of journeys over the face of the earth that eventually merge together in currents like two vast rivers.
Today, as you walk your feet onto the ground, remember the traces of all the feet that have walked here before you, feeling the veins of your body as they echo the veins of the vast rivers and all the many journeys.
And as your feet walk, your energy extends like a root system, reaching out in all directions from the soles of your feet, into the ground in yellow currents. Deeper and deeper they travel.
Until your feet become golden, painted carefully by the 12 solar beings of the ancient sun. They painted your feet to remind you that in each step there is light, a different nuance of light.
As the light travels through your colored feet into the veins of the earth, one step at a time, you begin to travel these rivers of light that guide you on your way.
As you step amongst the rivers of light, all direction disappears. Down is no longer down. Up is no longer up. All that is known is the union of earth and sky.
Listening in, what can you hear? Listening deep within, you begin to hear the distant voices of the elders coming to you like echoes in ripples and in currents.
In the distance, you can hear the elders talking of Atma, communing in the breath of Brahman. You can hear them telling a story of the body of our bread.
Amongst the sounds of branches and waterfalls, you can hear them talking about the collective body that flows within the ocean of sacred waters. These are the waters that also flow through your heart.
A place of holy ground, a place to call to and call forth again and again, to connect with the sacred waters.
A holy ground where the Mother of Grace resides, where the ground mother sits within the field of crows. The ground mother whose womb fruit presents you over and over again with the place of many colors, where you see visions, visions that call you to change.
Here, the ground mother is down on her knees, and the wheel of elm, ash, and oak go by, collecting the fruits of lands far and wide. She is there between leaves, salt, and stones. She sings the songs of all sounds. She pours the holy water onto the soil, and from it grows the sacred scripture.
Circulating the story of cleansing and blessing in you and also in you. She is covered in offerings of cloth of all kinds and of all colors. You are all my children, says the voice of the ground mother. You were all my children, she says.
And this land beneath your feet, where the river flows underneath and on top, is holy ground.
When you give to the earth drinks your gift so that you can offer it back in return. This is the scripture of cosmic law, says the ground mother.
Why then am I suffering? Said a voice to the ground mother. Because you are alive, the ground mother replied. Suffering is the route to find grace, a remembrance.
To call to the ocean of light that guides you from within, to a place where we are all connected.
Where we wait with an empty bowl to enkindle, as Atma travels between worlds, forms and things.
And the elements sing Sat Chit Anand.
With your golden feet, step into this soil, pour onto it your precious milk, and watch as you become the bosom of the earth. Blessings to you, and also to you. Thank you all for listening to the story.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that again. It's quite absorbing, isn't it, to hear. And I think it's a story that she does, which what all stories do, in that it seems so much of a piece of itself. It seems so whole and coherent. Yet when I heard it, I sort of sensed all these resonances and branches and sort of roots that sort of extended into different sort of fields of reference, you know, terms and images which I recognize as sort of at home in Hindu tradition, and terms which I recognize as being at home in the Christian tradition, but they are sort of loosened and sort of making their way into this sort of mediational space, this middle space where these sort of symbols and words can cohere together, is my feeling when I hear that story. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions, actually. Eva and Isik, you could perhaps say a little bit more about how people will, how this story be presented and how they will hear it, which will be on a kind of pilgrimage between the temple and the church. And there's lots of imagery and there's a motif of sort of movement, of points of connection, but also movement in that story. And I wondered if you would both maybe want to say a little bit about what you think this connection between story and sort of pilgrimage, the sort of, you know, the work of the feet and the work of, you know, and the work of the sort of story going together. That's all right.
Well, I'll go first. I didn't know.
Okay.
So, well, one of the things that really has inspired us throughout this project, and especially in this time, is how one can begin to think about their everyday journey just in their local environment, in a way as a little pilgrimage, in a way as a very special journey, which I think have been very highlighted by this year and the lockdown and things like that, because you just really appreciate what it's like to feel fresh air and what it is like to look at a tree and what it is actually like to have that bit of freedom in a way. So throughout the project, that was really present when we were speaking with both groups, and the story kind of evolved from that, in that sense of how can we relate to our everyday journeys as these little pilgrimages, as these sacred steps on the planet, that we're all in these steps all together at the same time, creating these pathways in a way, these rivers of light. So the story will actually be presented in a way that people can listen to it as they walk between the temple and the church, or the church and the temple. And on their walk, they will be passing Epping Forest and the trees. And then there will be different aspects of the work. Some of the installation work will be showing in the temple and the church. So it becomes that bridge, that mediating space in a way that Chris is talking about. And then people are invited to embed their own steps onto that path, along with everyone else that will walk it.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in this idea of mini pilgrimages and small acts of pilgrimage. We tend to think of pilgrimage as a sort of large scale, and the spectacle of pilgrimage, as it often becomes, we see on the TV news, don't we, whenever there's sort of annual events in India or Mecca or Jerusalem. It's these huge scale, sort of once in a lifetime kind of events, that walks that people go on. But many religious traditions, and the kind of traditions, the Christian and the Hindu traditions you're dealing with, have smaller pilgrimages written into them. If you like, throughout a day or throughout a liturgy, there is often a pilgrimage. There is a walking through, there is a walking around a creeds or a devotional act, which is thought of as a sort of model or miniature version of that. So in the Middle Age, in Christian Middle Ages, very few people went to like the Holy Lands, but they might go to a labyrinth in a sort of cathedral ground or on a cathedral floor, where you really sort of undertook a sort of a walking around that space in an attitude as if you were sort of walking to the Holy Land. Likewise, if you pray the Stations of the Cross, you know, it is a walking that line to Calvary. Or if you pray sort of the devotions of the Rosary in the sort of Catholic and Anglo-Catholic tradition, you know, it's the circle of beads is literally a kind of a story, kind of you work your way around this. So I like this idea of having a handheld, you know, or kind of local experience of something much larger, almost as if like, you know, there's a sort of a master story here which you've kind of co-created, but in this small space between the temple and the church, there's an opportunity to kind of set your one little journey within that sort of bigger narrative, that bigger journey. And I think that's a really interesting idea. And I know the idea of the local and of the personal and sort of, and I've heard you speak about handheld knowledge and handheld wisdom before, this idea that the smaller and intimate practices, creative and devotional practices, are very sort of important to sort of generating your ideas. So something I'm quite keen on, this sort of small walk, which is an iteration of something much larger. Because we are quite small beings, really. We are quite small people. They're not a great deal. Our sphere of influence is quite small, which is one of the things in terms of thinking about the relationship to the natural world and the relation to the Epping Forest. In some ways, you know, our influence is great, and you know, the current climate emergency is about recognizing the sort of scale of impact we have. But as individuals, you know, and in our going about our daily lives, the thing we come up against all the time is actually quite how limited our sphere of influence is, and often quite limited how our sphere of imagination is. You know, we're always looking to sort of meet other people's minds and other people's sort of ideas and language and share them. And I think that's something which I see kind of emerging out of this project. This what did you say the distance was? 500 meters between the temple and the church. So there's kind of a relatively small space there, but there is a kind of, I like the idea of how this walk kind of is paradoxically great, but also very small. It's a very small distance to walk, but it's this great bridge between different communities, different traditions, which are, you know, particularly the Hindu and Christian tradition, living in great proximity for a long, long time, but they're different worlds in many ways. You know, we talk about world religions, and you know, sociologists and students of religion will often use this term world religion, by which they mean a religion of the world. You know, but really what those religions give you is a complete world. If you inhabit a tradition like Christianity or Vaishnava or Shaivnav kind of Hinduism, you have a complete picture of the world. And so actually finding a kind of convergence of the world is quite a challenging and interesting thing to have attempted and achieved.
We were really interested in how, in the space of story, that connection that everyone does to that imaginary world that is greater than themselves continues to be a generative space, and it's not fixed, which is a similar way to when everyone drops into an act of prayer. Their root is part of that world of their religion, but their journey to that space of prayerfulness, or to that space of the source that we are all as humans connecting to, will look different and become different to everybody. So we wanted in the final work to have a sort of an expression of all of these beautiful, diverse layers that have been coming out through this project, of how we are to connect to something greater than ourselves, and how having a faith, which we've very much come to find through this project is our symbolic expression as artists, is similar to a faith, because we create a world of symbols that connect us to something greater than ourselves and allow us to open our hearts to things that change and emerge. And that feels a very important part of working with the story, because everybody can bring themselves to it, and it's currently still evolving, and there are people here who've sent wonderful reflections on the story that we will be weaving in the coming time before it's formed.
That's really interesting, thank you. You've said a little bit about the installation work. It might be helpful if you explained, or even if Laura is able to show people what the works, the installation will be, what you will be sort of moving between, so you're going to have some object in the temple and object in the church. I believe there's the...
So the objects that are there are our ways of telling and showing the essence of the story. So everything again roots back to the story that we've just shared.
Mm.
And one of the characters in the story is this energy of the ground mother that came from one of our listening sessions where we were learning symbols from these worlds, basically. And within one of those sharing, somebody gifted these two words of ground and mother, and we really resonated with it as an idea to bring that together. So we set about sharing this idea, this inspiration that had come from listening, and how she might be formed. So there's a word in the story that she is there covered in offerings of cloth. So everybody who was part of the project, many people chose to offer a piece of cloth that they considered sacred for this process of calling in holy ground. And that was becoming the ground mother in human form, was through these layers of cloth. This image is actually one of the women from the temple, Minaben, who was working with one of the cloths that had been made as part of the story of the grandmother in this image. So as well as the storytelling, there was also performances that were done for camera, which was people not only demonstrating parts of their faith as an act that was recorded, but also people bringing their heart expression and different aspects to the symbolic story. And this is Rosemary in the church. And we were really interested in the use of bells in both groups. And these bells actually travelled between different people and different places throughout the project. Anyway.
So your participants all contributed cloth for this character of the grandmother. How much was the character of the grandmother sort of shaped by the kinds of cloth that people were offering? Have you got a sense of people have been forming their ideas about who this character of the grandmother might be based on kind of objects they gave?
Yeah. I think there was an intention of what people wanted to offer to the essence of who she was, but the form of who she was, Eva and I were creating from some of the stories. So the fabrics actually become like a river, which was, there was a lots of linkages with sacred rivers in our discussion. So there was the pilgrimages that people in London had done to the River Lee, and there was stories of the Saraswati River and the Ganges River that we were shared with by the people in the temple group. And then there was this beautiful coincidence that the River Lee was actually originally named out of a Celtic tribe for light, and they used to worship the River Lee in a similar way to the Saraswati is worshipped. And this then became like the rivers in the importance of the rivers and the waters kind of started evolving from that place. So the cloak is actually has then there's 2 rivers that go from the same source that is white and cascade into all of the many colors that were given from the offerings of all the people.
And I think in terms of the objects, in a way, the groundmother object is very much been evolved from the idea of this prayerfulness that we offer in our relationship to, well, something that is greater than ourselves, but also in particular in this project to the earth itself. So the idea of honoring the earth as part of that greater sense, that greater cycle, which we're all part of. And then the other object that we've made that we will be showing in, so the groundmother will be showing in the church, and then the earth scripture is the other object. And this is an object that has been created and it's been taken to various powerful elemental places in nature, such as waterfalls and mountains and ancient stone gates, and sort of been embedded by the messages of the earth. So it's the earth is kind of in a way imprinted onto the fabric, and then we've done an interpretation with symbolic stitching of those elemental forces. And this object forms as a four river cloak or 4-armed cloak that can also be worn by a person, or it can be like a scroll that is rolled up as a 4-part scripture. So this is the other object that we'll be showing as part of the installation. So it's kind of that realm between the human and the nature within the 2 objects in a way.
Yeah, I was really interested when I first heard about this idea of the earth scripture. This came out because one of the ideas I'm very much interested in reviving is the idea of the natural world as a book, as a kind of text. So some of you may or not know this, but in the Middle Ages in Europe, there was this very common idea. Well, it started about the 3rd century actually, but it continued throughout Christian, but also Islamic and Jewish philosophy of pre-modern times, was the idea that nature was a book to be read and interpreted and studied. And Christian theology in particular had this idea that there were 2 books to be studied for theology. You studied the book of nature and the book of the Bible, and that you couldn't look at one without the other, which is why, you know, we look back at sort of the great Christian theologians, people like Thomas Aquinas, Nicholas of Cusa, people who might be familiar to Christians in the West now. Before they studied any theology, they were all experts in botany and mathematics and geometry and physics, because they had to look at the world and understand it and see it as a series of signs that was speaking to them about, you know, like Ava's phrase of something greater than themselves that needed to be read and understood. And I'm particularly interested in this idea of how this sort of text of nature to be read and interpreted literally, mystically, you know, all these different ways we have of reading a sacred text. It could be a sort of powerful way of sort of showing how different religious communities and non-religious communities kind of might live together, you know, how they might read from, you know, it's a common book, you know, it's the one story that we all live in is the story of the planet. It's the one narrative we're all involved in. So I would like to hear a little bit more really about what that sort of idea of the scripture of the earth might mean. Have you got a clear view of what it means within the story itself, within the sort of imaginal realm, or is it a kind of sort of testament in its own right? Do you think, how do you think people might engage with that?
think it's both. It's an invitation for the person listening to the story to I sort of receive the messages of that imagination with the trees, so that they can start maybe thinking about things in a different way in that space. But I guess there's also an invitation to sort of maybe revisit some of the symbolism of those texts and of those scriptures that have been written, and how we might have lost contact with the source of them. So for instance, the imagery that we have, the enactment in the church where the wine and the bread are turned into this, the blood and the body, which is a really beautiful kind of sense of embodying something that's been made by the hands and mixed together, and is very much part of a natural cycle with the land and the harvest and the crops. And then suddenly it finds itself in this religious space, and have we remembered that cycle of the seasons that have taken that, you know, that bread, so it becomes that sacred bread and that sacred body. In the same way as in the Hindu faith, we were shared many stories about the waters of the Ganges, and how it is to be in the Ganges and feel you are connected with the source of all things. And so that then every time you receive water over your body, you are reconnecting with that source. And there is something really beautiful about that state of aliveness, that people who are in these prayerful acts with bread or with water, we're actually in their everyday life. So again, going back to that act of pilgrimage being our everyday life, contacting that space of that divine otherness. So I guess in the story, when you're walking through the trees, they have got many things to speak about, and many symbols that we can receive. So it was an invitation to dream into that space, I guess.
Yeah, that's so. The way that the sort of natural world is related to in sort of religious texts, I think it's often becomes just a metaphor, you know. So if you think of like the parables of Jesus or the teachings of Jesus, when Jesus says something like, consider the lilies of the valley, often people these days fall into a trap and think that that's just sort of a slightly wistfulness or naivety about that image, but those kinds of stories and those kinds of teachings are always rooted in a kind of an intimate familiarity with a place and a thing. And so, you know, beautiful natural imagery throughout biblical images, like you say, which inform and provide the substance, as you say, Isik, for what Christians do in their worship, you know, how they use bread and wine. You know, it often needs remembering that they are connected to a sort of a real intimacy with the earth and a real kind of affirmation of the earth. I'm less knowledgeable about the Indian tradition, but I do know there was sort of work of the Hindu theologian Shankara, who writes all the time in natural images and natural parables, and you read it wrong if you think that it's just an image or just a metaphor to explain something else. It is actually connected to, you know, it's an image and a teaching that makes sense because there is an intimate knowledge of waterways and animals and plants. That's how these sort of teachings can work.
And this project offered a really interesting reflection of receiving those symbols in a very different context. So actually intending to receive them in a different context. So we've both become much more aware then about what is being said. So in the church, the honoring of like that bread as like what human hands have made. And then in the Hindu culture, prayers that connect the whole body to all the elements of the world around them. And this is kind of recited that we are always just returning to the elements. So we don't die, we're just kind of returning to this elemental space. And actually for us to kind of be almost from this really heart space, absorbing these different symbology has been really beautiful. And then linking about how that links to the symbology we use in our work and our sort of practice all the time. I
think what this makes this an interesting project that you've done is, I think it's a challenge, certainly knowing what I do of like from inside the Christian tradition, but I can't speak for the Hindu tradition, is that step from outside of life to liturgical life, you know. So in your liturgy, you can talk about the things that the earth has given and human hands have made, but then when you go out, you know, it's maintaining that connection to that world of sort of like resonant symbols, to the world of, you know, often quite functional and reductive sort of, you know, we're encouraged, and often we're encouraged all the time to see things as have quite a reductive view of the world and think of things as quite sort of simple and functional. So, and we might be reminded in our liturgies and in our prayers about that sort of real connection to sort of the lands, but it's quite a challenge to maintain, actually. And this is why I think about sort of experiencing that sort of like bridge between liturgical life and ordinary life, whether we might think that might be moving between the church and the temple through this other mediational realm of the sort of story that you've co-created and the objects you've made, will be a sort of really interesting sort of extra threshold to sort of cross. I think that's a really interesting sort of idea to be pursuing. I'm aware that I'm talking quite a lot and putting in questions of my own, so I'll just have to remind people that if you do have questions, or there's something that you want to sort of like press either and check more on about this project, though some of you are more involved with this than others, so do please, you know, raise a hand or put something in the chat, you know, so do feel free to you know, interrupt at any point as it goes.
I wanted to just say one thing as well about this, what we were just speaking about. And I think one of the things that has really been very strong for us throughout this project is that a lot of the participants that we've been working with, they've been more like elders in a way. They've been elders, and there's been a lot of women as well, so female elders. And that's also why this idea of the ground mother felt very strong and very present, actually. And that idea of how we can connect to that wisdom of the elder, both as nature and also an elder, that is also something that we've become quite disconnected from in this day and age. And we also feel that there is this essence in this connection to the infinite, or to the mystery of life, that they're still carrying so beautifully within them through their faith, but also through their daily practices. And we feel that, you know, in moving out a little bit of this rational, functional space, where often religion can get quite criticized by outsiders, what we wanted to create through the project was this experience of something of the essence that we've felt throughout the project. And we feel that the earth scripture and the story and the ground mother again becomes this symbology that is very universal and archetypal. So it's almost like before we categorize it as part of anything in particular, but just this permission actually to connect to something that is more within the unknown, and that is within that space of mystery, which actually brings a lot of hopefulness. And I think that's been one of the key things during this project, is how can we create a bridge of hopefulness between us as humans, between us as us and nature, and also between different groups of faith and different generations, because one of the things that we really feel that we need for the near future and for the long-term future is actually a faith and a hopefulness. You know, whatever that looks like, we do need to keep that space of a sacred relationship with something in order to come together in new ways. So I think that's also just on the themes of that, with the story and the earth scripture and the grandmother. I just wanted to add that it's just been such an honor to have been, you know, been in the presence of all of these wise women and men, and just listening to all of this knowledge has been very, very powerful.
And incredibly humbling, because I think there's something in that space of prayer and that space of wisdom that you encounter when you sit and you receive that prayer from somebody who's been in that faith for their whole lives. It's the most incredible thing, because it does nothing other than open your heart. And it's sort of, how can we all get to the space of doing that, so that we can receive and co-create other types of futures, relationships with the planet and each other, has been a really, it's kept echoing itself back throughout the work, basically.
Yeah, I can certainly second that. Sort of, I've not been involved in the project, but I like the idea of this hope, and that hope that's something kind of anchored in what is older rather than something novel. You know, hope is a sort of forward-looking kind of attitude, isn't it? And often, but I think we're mistaken if we think we're looking for something novel. Okay, and so much like the technological and political fixes which come up for our social and environmental ills, always looking for the novel, the new thing. But actually, hope and actual change often involves working with what is actually present and what is best and oldest in a culture and in an imaginary realm, rather than sort of, you know, hoping, you know, anticipating that something completely unimaginable and unexpected might happen. You actually got to work with these materials. That's why I quite liked. It's one of the things that I'm always fascinated by the aesthetic of Fourthland's work, is that it's always very uncanny and sort of new, in that I've never seen anything like it before. But whenever I see it, it looks like it. Whenever I see it in place, it looks like it's been there a long time, and almost as if the gallery has been built around it, because it looks so sort of authentic and something sort of solid, you know, like Stonehenge or something like that you just can't imagine it not being there. And so the idea that you've created this sort of new story to mediate between the communities, the congregations, and their shared relationship with the land. The very fact that it's new, but it is kind of composite of what people have offered, that they've carried around with them from their own, or that have been carried in their traditions, I think is so interesting, and what makes it so sort of rich and resonant.
Does anyone here have any questions?
Someone's just popped up. Harry's just asked a question. So Harry says, I'm wondering how we can sustain this inspiration and prayerfulness at the moment when access to spiritual communities is so limited. That's a really interesting question, and it's a very sensitive one to people of all religious and non-religious kind of sensibilities. One of the things that's been slightly difficult and maybe dispiriting for a lot of people of different sort of religious sort of like commitments over COVID has been restrictions on access to sacred spaces or congregational spaces. And in a way, part of that, what's challenging about that is the kind of idea of equivalence that is suggested by that, like as if churches are equivalent to a supermarket or Sports Direct, or, you know, all these other kind of like commercial spaces, equivalent to commercial spaces. And I think that's been challenging and hard for people of faith. But I mean, how do people sustain it?
I think a really good way of beginning is to realize we are in relationship with non-human forms. And one of the greatest challenges we have, and one of the ideas with this call to holy ground, is actually, how do we drop into that prayerfulness to create this holy ground, is actually allowing ourselves to open our hearts to say there is more vibrating on this planet than just human words. And this is often where the inspiration for much of the sacred books came from, people sitting in this really deep place with themselves and receiving messages from other places. And I think there's been a lot to find comfort in actually having a dialogue with a tree or with a flower, and going back to what you were saying about nature becoming this sacred scripture. And there's a beautiful Sufi quote that I have in my home, that it says that the leaves on the tree are like the ancient scriptures that our souls are waiting to read. And there's something just really magical that actually is really hard, because we've never been shown and we've never been guided in a secular culture to be in dialogue with something greater than ourselves, because it's all been very human based. So it is a loss that we're trying to find our way back into symbolic communing with otherness, whatever that otherness is. I
mean, I agree with all of that. I think this is something that we came up in our conversation the other day, is that one of the restrictions of the pandemic one of the things it's done is sort of highlighted restrictions that kind of were already there in the first place, certain kinds of alienation that were already there, and some of the response to that has been that people have been enabled to engage in a more reflective or more kind of semi-disciplined spiritual reflection on the places where they live. I mean, for me, it's just kind of wandering around collecting conkers is what it has been throughout the autumn, and then collecting pine, things that I can kind of hold in my hand and sort of like absorb in for a period of time, and try and read some sense into them, to kind of play off Isik's Sufi quote, to try and figure out what they might be trying to tell me, or tell us. That's part of it.
I think there's another question.
I think Francis did you want to say something?
Well, I just wanted to reinforce, I think, Jill Sakakini's question, which was just to say thank you, Chris, for mediating so beautifully yourself between the artists and this other audience tonight. But could we now just hear a little bit from some of the people who are participating in this, from both temple and church? That would be lovely.
I don't know anyone by name, so I can't kind of like.
Well, there are 5 of them here. There's Tara, who I'm sure she can wave, and then there's Pramila, who hasn't got her camera on, and there's Manju, and there's Chris and Nicole, and everybody other than Tara seems to have momentarily turned the camera off. They are all here. Oh no, they're back. Chris, Nicole, would you like to say anything? You might have to unmute yourself.
I think Tara needs to unmute herself too.
Yes, Tara. Yes, go on.
I'd like to say, Chris mentioned several theologians, but not Teilhard de Chardin, who I think is an important figure. Okay.
Go on.
Well, I'm not a specialist, so I won't say anything much, but I think there's something to sort of explore,
Have you something
also of the new interest for the planet also?
People might not know about him. I don't know.
Yeah, Teilhard de Chardin is very, very important, influential 20th century theologian, who was a very, very accomplished natural scientist as well, and kind of is still sort of generating sort of new interest and sort of joining up this interest, joining up the sacred and the physical, the stuff of life in a really interesting, esoteric way. Yeah, thank you.
I think people might like to hear from the Hindu community, Tara perhaps, or
There's
Manju or Pramila. I think that's important, no?
Yes.
No, I mean, it's very difficult to keep me quiet often, people find. But our Vedic culture has taught us all this. We live with nature. Our, as you were saying, they're not apart from us. So when you say mother in the ground, we actually call Prithvi as mother. We call Ma Prithvi. So for us, it's all, nature is part of our life. And what we have found, and Chris, I thought Chris might mention that for many years, it's been about 12 years, we formed a interfaith community here. And we do our spiritual, now we're doing every week, but once a month. And we have found there is more common with the nature's element. And with the church, we have been working for about now for 8 years, and we actually formed this group of Faith and Friendship Club on the basis of, it sounds funny, with the singing, dancing, and art and culture. When we wrote for our grant, that's what we did. And we are since then finding our cultures, and there's so much common, and there is so much commonality in nature, the way we worship, the way we do things. Because I know 3 faith forums have a lot, because they've been from the same origin. But we find with Vedic culture goes back a long time back, and every part, like a water and the earth and the ground and the trees and leaves, we have all built in our culture, and they're part of our daily life. That's what I think Isik was mentioning, and that's how it evolved. It is we are not artists and we are not theologists, but this is how we live our lives, and this is how we portray our lives. And I think thank you very much to bring it into your artwork. We appreciate that very much.
Thank you, Dara. And thank you, Nicole and Chris as well. Pramila or Manju, would you like to share anything about being part of the project or anything else? Because another element of the project that we haven't spoken much about is actually these performance gestures for the camera, where some of the symbols were either offered as they were, or people brought themselves to interpret part of the story. And it was Manju and Pramila's contribution to that have been really special, as well as Tara and Nicole and Chris. But I just wanted to say thank you for that.
I could, if anybody likes, I could just share some more of the images, perhaps to wrap things up. I mean, some of them I have are of Manju. Shall I do that? You'll forgive me sort of rummaging around. Oh, well, there's one anyway, so we'll do that. Yeah, this is Manju, who very bravely stepped into the hollow ponds, which are in Epping Forest, and then emerged onto this lovely white scroll.
And this is a really beautiful example of how the story that was collectively created then resonated with Manju, who is also a dancer, and a beautiful Indian dancer. And then she brought a combination of that to the new part of it and became a character in the story. The being of the ancient sun.
Shall I find another one? We got time for a couple more. Hold on. Do you want to? Should we show Rani? Rani. Hold on.
Have you got any of the forest one?
Yeah, that when it was the group of you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I'll bring those up. Yeah. This is one.
What is happening here?
This is the sacred cloth emerging into the forest. So it was a gesture, which was the cloth was like the river that was connecting everybody together that is present in the objects. And this is Rani doing the gesture of the forest receiving the offering of this cloth that's also the waters.
Just give me one moment and I'll find the ones that Tara spoke about.
No, yeah, Reskabe and then.
Yeah, sorry, they're in a different folder, so.
There's so many images.
There are a lot. And I store them in different places. Wait a minute. I think they are here though.
Something I find interesting about the way the way that what the images show me is how this sort of imaginal mediation happens between art and religion. So what good art, like Fourthland's art, I think does so well is when I see those images, and such as the cloth, which is the water, it's focus great attention to the material of things, but nothing is ever just the material. It's always, you know, it's very conspicuous that the material is itself, but more, you know, it's not a substitute, or it's not reductive view in the same way that, you know, Tara was saying in ritual life, objects are brought in, or in sort of regard for the religious regard for the natural world. You know, a leaf is never just a leaf, it's always something else. And if we're talking about sort of what religion or religious attitude to the natural world might be, it's too often characterized, I think, mischaracterized as a flight from the natural world, you know, a retreat from reality, a retreat from the real world, as if you choose a religious faith, a world of symbol and imagination, then you leave the natural world behind, which actually, what people have said already, it just isn't true. You don't lose the world, you get more world, you get a richer world. And I think that is what is to be defended and sought, I think.
Yeah. And the images you see of Tara and a few others from the temple gathered in those trees between the church and the temple, and they came with the deity and to offer a prayer and what they call the arti, which is an offering of light, instead of in the temple to the deity, outside to the trees, as a different type of action again that was for the camera. So it was kind of this idea of how those symbols are happening within their practice, how would people like to offer them in different ways. So this was the one of Tara and other beings, expressions of that. We also just really loved all the colours, because often artists, it's a bit scary working with quite so many colours. And there's a tendency that people then want to remove them. So it's really beautiful to just really honour that diversity of all the colours that came, not only in the clothes and in the nature, but in the cloths and in the offerings.
If I could just go a bit off piste, when you were talking at the start about the journeys that people make with their feet as they walk through wherever they're going, through cities, even a short space or whatever, I was immediately came to mind something I've always been very moved by, which is the route through in Coventry between the old cathedral and the new cathedral, which leads into the commercial heart of the city. And it's not only that there is the sort of commercial route between two buildings associated with religious practices, purposes, but also that one is a ruin, the cause of the bombing in 1940, and the other is the sort of rebirth of the cathedral afterwards, with the following a competition and so on. And so you've got, you know, extraordinary layers of history, but this sense of the ongoing present also in it. And I just find that a very eloquent space. It's been lovely hearing your story tonight and everything, but I think I will certainly try to make small pilgrimages, being more aware of where I'm going. But I do find that the historical thing is quite an important part of it too, that to be able to look at a building and recognize it from another period and wonder how they lived in that building at that time, and what echoes and resonances, as Chris's word that Chris has used, can still be seen and felt, even though we're walking often through very busy streets with a strong, harsh commercial emphasis on commodities and things like that. So it's fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you
for sharing that.
Well, thank you all. It's been a fantastically interesting event. Thank you.
I know that route in Coventry as well, and I have similar feelings. You go from the ruin, that the new cathedral and the Graham Sutherland sort of windows. It's so light and bright in there, and it's like you say. I mean, I think pilgrimages always have a script of birth, death, and rebirth sort of written in them. It's sort of the journey. It's the sort of underlying narrative, you know, in terms of the journey you go on, you know, sort of to receive a blessing in a certain place, or to sort of undergo estrangement in some ways as well, you know, to leave home, to come back, you know. I think of, you know, that like Tolkien's Hobbit is all about, you know, a journey out and back again, you know, it's about arriving home, you know, and you know, Tolkien's got this very grand vision of fantasy and sort of movement around the world, but actually there's lots of just sort of small journeys between small intimate places as well. But I like
just wanted to say about this pilgrimage thing, because our pilgrimages are all to the natural world. They are not, I mean, the buildings are part of where the deities are just put there, but most of our pilgrimages are to the places of nature. And that is quite important part of our thing. And I found part of that when in Spain, was the name of that, you know, people go for pilgrimage, and I was there, and you know, for 2-3 days, and I saw people, they carry water. This water is very important part of all the pilgrimage, I think, you know, whenever you see and this water forms a very big part of pilgrimage. But I wanted Chris to say, but we are part of interfaith group where we do a pilgrimage every year in our borough. We walk in one day of about 8 to 10 places of worship of different faith. Now this year we were, I don't know it was good or bad, but it was, I think, fortunate, because we did through Zoom, and we visited every faith individually, giving more time. And it was very fulfilling, get to know them at a closer quarter, you know, and it was about gratitude, and gratitude was towards the nature, towards the people, and towards others. So it was, pilgrimages are wonderful part, and it has been a very spiritual experience for all the people who join those pilgrimages. You know, I think some of it you have been part of, Isik and Eva, haven't you? Yes. No, thanks.
Thank you, Tara.
Thank you.
I think it's wonderful that we can have pilgrimage without actually walking anywhere. I mean, you know, would be nice as well, but isn't it fantastic that actually we can access some of the same benefits that we get from pilgrimage through technology, and you know, it's been a lifeline for so many, I think, during this time. I think if no one else has any really burning questions, I'll wrap things up now. But please do stay in touch with us if you want to. The artists are very willing to, you know, have more participants speak to them or email with us. So please do that, and obviously, yeah, come and visit Leytonstone when it's open. We'll let you know, and hopefully you can experience it for yourselves. But so just remains really for me to say big big thank you to Chris and also to Ava and Isik for joining us this evening and giving us such a fascinating and rich dialogue between us. So thank you for joining too.
Thank you.
Everyone who's been involved in the journey of this project.
Thank you.
I look forward to my pilgrimage to Leytonstone to
we'll make it worth a while. Great. Well, good night, everybody. Nice to see you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.